This is the Gauntlet Podcast. My name is Lowell. With me for this particular episode is David Morrison, who is a regular player and GM on the Gauntlet. Thank you for joining us, David.
Oh, thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to having a little chat.
Now, you just joined kind of last year. How long have you been playing with us?
That's correct. In fact, it was about this time last year I started, getting into the podcast, joined up on the Patreon. In fact, my first game was your game of Prism that you ran.
Oh, that's right.
Back in, I think that was the end of August, wasn't it?
Yeah. When she was getting ready to do the whole Kickstarter for that.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And you're in England, right?
I am, yeah. I am. I'm in Sheffield, in the north of England, in Yorkshire.
I know that there's a fairly large game convention down in southern England. Is there a decent convention scene up in the northern part?
Well, Sheffield, as cities go, it's not huge, but there's a fairly active role-playing scene, certainly around the university. These days, actually, I'm not in it so much. I just tend to play with friends and on the Gauntlet, obviously. But we do have quite a friendly local hotel where we get a few very sort of small-scale, sort of 50 to 100-man conventions, but they run a few there every year. I get along to some of those on occasion. Yeah,
it used to be a bigger thing here in the U.S. gaming community of the small sort of hotel gatherings, but I think that has fallen off in the last decade or so. So listeners, for the first part of our episode, we're going to talk about the games that we played in our previous month, which would be June for this particular episode. And then we're going to talk about one of those. Then we'll move on to the next segment. So I'm going to start. Normally Jason, who had some technical issues, would be here to put it into my lap. But here we go. I had a pretty good June. Off the Gauntlet, I played 13th Age, played Urban Shadows, played Trail of Cthulhu, Hearts of Wulin, Changing the Lost, Powered by the Apocalypse, the hack that we've done for that. And also I went to Origins, where we had a chance to meet with a lot of the face-to-face with a number of the Gauntleteers. And I know that Sherry is going to talk about that in our next episode. She's going to lean to that discussion. On Gauntlet, I did the last few sessions of Things from the Flood, which if you've listened to the last couple episodes, you've heard me talk a little bit more about that than probably should have. Then I finally got to run Monster Hearts, which was really fun. And then Pasión de las Pasiones, which is the one I want to talk about here. So Pasión de las Pasiones is a game from Magpie Games. It's currently an Ashcan version. It's a Powered by the Apocalypse game of Latino telenovela melodramas. And it's by Brandon Leon Gambetta, who has a pretty active Twitter presence and has also been doing a number of videos in his channel, primarily for masks, but for some other things about gaming, I recommend those. Pasión is exactly what it says on the label. Mexican telenovela, soap operas, has very classic archetypes. We've got 6 very basic playbooks, has a simple set of moves. It does a very interesting thing in that there are no stats, no characteristics to roll from. Instead, every move has 2 questions, and for each yes answer, you get a +1 towards your roll. And then each playbook also has a question that they can always apply, and so you're rolling 0 to +3. It also has a mechanic of the audience reactions, which I'll talk about a little bit later. The game itself is in process. The Ashcan version came out, I think, the end of now 2017. They've been playtesting it, and they've made some significant changes to it. This version that I ran from included some of those changes that they've made since the Ashcan. And I've run it before, and I've talked about it on the podcast before, but I love this game. I really do. It's super fun, super evocative, and I will say the changes that Brandon has made are solid. They are very good. Some of the issues that I know I had and that Jim Crocker, who's also run it, has had, this fixes some of those problems. In particular, the game had a mechanical resource of leverage that applied to a lot of moves and required tracking that, and it also used to fuel some of the moves, and it didn't quite work. Resource tracking in PBTA games is a controversial thing. In this case, it wasn't hitting on all cylinders. Just taking that out and redoing sort of how conditions and harm worked and just taking all of that element out, it's really strong. It's a game with evocative moves that really fit the genre, like demand what you deserve, face certain death, which is one of my favorites. And in fact, I finally got somebody to have to roll that, and they came back disfigured with another face, and they did it early enough in the last session that they were able to come back in this secondary identity. The playbook moves are really good. La empleada, I think that's how you say it, the employee, has a move where they can overhear a conversation between two players, or a player and NPC, or a couple of NPCs after it's started or after it's gone on. It's a really interesting move. I haven't seen anything quite like that in other PBTA games, and it changes up the dynamic. It allows you to reframe another vision on a scene. It has some tools that I really love in that you can retcon some things. You've got some flashback moves. There's a flashback to preparations and reveal a shocking truth. These things all allow you to say, well, I have this in play, or I have this ready. But the reveal a shocking truth and then one of the standard moves, accuse someone of lying, have a couple of interesting possibilities, particularly that with the accuse someone of lying, you can accuse them of lying, and if you want to spend your hold or your pick for it, you can say that what you've said is true, even if the audience has seen something else completely different. So you can build in these dramatic reversals, dramatic twists. You can do the same thing with reveal a shocking truth. These are all interesting ways to go back to earlier established fiction and have a mechanic that can turn that around. That being said, it's also one of those moves that I think it's super important for the GM and the players to check in. Like, if you change up someone's fiction, or you change up something that they've already gotten, you like switch out or undercut a move that's already gone forward, you need to check in on that. I think that's absolutely essential to that. And then the last thing I really love about this new version is each playbook has 4 conditions. Each of those conditions gives a +1 to one move and a -2 to another move, and they're unique. Like, the combination of conditions that each playbook has is unique and relates to who and what the playbook is about. And when they get them all marked, then they go to a meltdown. David, have you played Pasión?
No, I haven't. I really want to change that. It's high up there on the list of ones I want to try out. I'm thinking of, at some point, I want to run it for some friends here, because I know I have a couple of friends who would really dig that whole soap opera element to it. I picked up the Ashcan, as I said, when it was released. Or certainly last year I picked up anyway, if not exactly when it released. I've been kind of holding off on, waiting to see the newer version of it, to see the changes that's been made. But it sounds really interesting. I think, just to say, the questions in particular I really like as a nice sort of piece of text. So yeah, I'm glad to see that they do work out.
And I would say that if I were going to look at a PBTA game that would be an introductory PBTA game, like I wanted to show it to new, potentially not tabletop players, I think that this is a great one. I think this would definitely be one of the top ones I would use to do that, because the mechanics are relatively lightweight. The moves sell themselves. There aren't that many playbook moves. There aren't that many choices to do. So I think it's really good on that. I do want to point out, because the nature of our program means that now I'm going to say some things that I'm less certain about with the game. The question mechanics are great. I love that idea. It's really evocative. It makes us stop and ask what's going on in the moment. It does mean, if you're more used to just going to a roll, okay, roll hot or roll fierce or whatever, this is a pause thing. So it does have a little bit more of a speed bump than other moves do, but I'm fine with that. Hearts of Wulin has the same set of choices that you have to go through. The only thing is that I noticed in playing through is that each of the playbooks that has this is the question that goes to all the moves. Some of them were super applicable, and some of them were less applicable. For example, the contrast that struck me is the Ladonna is our matriarch, our maneuverer behind the scenes, pulling people and manipulating them. And they have a question that is, are you keeping your hands clean? So are you getting at distance? That kind of thing. Whereas the employee has the question, are you in over your head? Well, the employee is always in over their head. That is almost always going to be a yes answer to that. Whereas some of the other playbooks, it takes a little bit more. You have to lean into it a little bit more. And that's just a minor thing. I'm trad enough that I always look for parity and balance, which I probably shouldn't. But it just struck me that that was one that we kept hitting.
Yeah, I was going to say it does, especially with that, the one, I mean, obviously I've not seen it in context, so I'm just speaking off the top of my head here. When you're rolling a move, it seems very difficult to say, oh, I'm keeping my hands clean, because generally speaking, at the point something's come to a move, you're probably not. And so that does seem like a tricky one to pull off.
Yeah, it requires a lot more angling and setup to get that into position to get a yes on that. Another move that I really, really like, but I need to figure out how to do it better at the table or what the structure for it is there's a move called Process Your Feelings Aloud. And this is a great idea. This is the move where someone looks out the window and there's rain falling on the window and they're flashing back to things that have happened and they're talking aloud about what they're feeling, what the challenges are. And this move is rolled differently. You actually check in with the audience members, which means all the other players, and ask if they are rooting for that character at that moment. And for each yes, they get a +1. And then you roll to see, and if they succeed, they get an answer from the audience about something that they want, how to get it, and then they can set up a scene. It's a great move, but sometimes I feel like I'm not doing it justice, or I'm not sure exactly how we need to be framing the question of, are you rooting for them, and how are they getting the answer, and who's supposed to answer, because it's supposed to be the audience as a whole. Do I need to poll the table? It's one I'm looking forward to seeing the final version of, to see how Brandon explains that. And so that's the other thing. The last thing is, and this has gotten better from the earlier version, the game has this concept that there are these different audience members. There are 5 of them that represent the family sitting at home. So, we have the father, we have the daughter, we have the grandmother, and they all react to different things. What happens in this version, it's very close to the previous version, is if another player sees that you've made someone gasp, made the mother gasp at your awfulness, then you hand that audience member card, because you would have the cards in the middle of the table. It gives them an XP, which is the only way to get XP right now. And it gives them a card with a special ability that they can then spend to do something like set up a private scene or get a 10+ and so on. And it's really good. It's a dynamite thing. At the table, it's going to be aces, because we'll have those cards. They'll be right in front of us. It is less easy to manage in an online game. And I don't think I figured out the best way to do it. It's very easy to overlook those. It's very easy to forget that they're out there. So I need to find a way to get that to work.
Yeah, that's one of my common complaints. I absolutely adore games that use tactility to manage resources, just play the game in general. But the second you get to online play, it often adds more. It makes it more difficult rather than easier, I find, when you start having to track different moving pieces. And yeah.
It's why when I run Fate online, it's as super stripped back on that. And I can't really do the home game that we do that is purely card-based. So it's a real challenge. I guess what I'm saying, my takeaway from this is a solid and fun game. I'm running a number of sessions of it for Magpie at Gen Con this year. I'm really looking forward to the final version. This is a dynamite game. I hope that one of the things that we see in the final version is some essays on different telenovela genres from the different countries, because I did some reading on that, and apparently there are very different themes and approaches and tropes in different places. And not telenovela necessarily, but I love K-dramas, Korean dramas. I've said that before on the podcast, and having some tools to do those kinds of stories would also be really exciting to me. Any questions about that, David?
Well, no, I think I interrupted a fair amount during that, but the Process Your Feelings move, that sounds really interesting. That is exactly my kind of thing. I love those sort of those things that draw out that stuff, and maybe talking a little bit more about that later. But
yeah, it's not like anything I've seen. It's a very abstract meta move.
Yeah.
So, David, tell us, how was your June? What did you play?
Yes, certainly. I had a very good June of role playing in person off the gauntlet. I finished a very long running campaign of Legend of the Five Rings. That's using the 4th edition rules, so the previous AEG one.
Interesting.
That's sort of my Friends at Home campaign. So it's been going on for years now. Mostly, I will admit, because, we're now all people of a certain age. So we have a tendency to, get together once a week, go, yeah, we'll play the game, and then just spend the evening sitting around and nattering rather than actually getting on with it. But it's been good fun, and it's nice to have finally reached a conclusion with it.
For all of its problematic elements, I love L5R. So
yeah, and I'm actually going to be introducing the campaign of players to, well, certainly our first PBTA game as a group. I'm going to be running a bit of a play test of Mythseer in sort of that slot, so I'm looking forward to that.
I'm very excited about that game.
Yeah.
So
on Gauntlet, which is, as I was saying, where I do the majority of my gaming at the minute. I have been playing lots of games with Leandro, who was on last time.
Mm-hmm.
We were in the same time zone, and he's an excellent GM, so I end up in a lot of his games. His ongoing Masks game, The Suits, based in the Suits playset for Masks, it's in one of the books. I forget which off the top of my head.
Like Unbound, maybe?
Unbound, I think you're right, yeah. That's been brilliant. Also, a playtest of his trophy incursion that will be in the upcoming version of Codex, which was excellent. It was really evocative, so I enjoyed that a lot. Also played in Rich's 1%er hack for Star Wars, the Swoop Gang one, which was brilliant.
He loved that. He really thought that sung for you guys.
It was amazing. It was really good. And I suppose I will have to, at this point out that another of his 1% hacks is currently on Kickstarter.
Yes.
So a little bit of a plug there. Do check that out. And finally, I ran a campaign throughout June as well of Comrades, and that's the game I'm going to be speaking about today.
This is wild because until I saw it on the calendar, I had not heard of this at all.
Yeah, I don't remember where it was that I first picked up on it from. I can't remember if it was on the Plus One Forward episode, or if I just, it was one of those that just popped up into my timeline and on Twitter, and it appealed to me. So yeah, I've been running that. That's all the games I've played in June. So yeah, Comrades is it's another Powered by the Apocalypse game. This one, however, is about revolution. Very specifically, or more specifically, I should say, it's got a focus towards overtly sort of violent revolution, armed revolution, and in particular, it takes a lot of inspiration on sort of revolutions of the 20th century. So that's kind of the most focused description of it, I suppose. It's by W.M. Akers, is the chap's name who wrote it. The first thing to be said about this is that it is obviously overtly political. I mean, I'm not going to dignify the whole, can you remove politics from any creative work?
Right.
But, this is written with a political agenda. And it's, literally stated at the front of the book that, this is a sort of call to arms amongst the left and a reminder of the struggles and sacrifices of revolution. That's our kicking off point for the game. Ironically, in terms of the game itself, it isn't all that revolutionary, I'd say. It's a fairly down the line, very sort of apocalypse world, dungeon world end of the sort of PBTA spectrum, I suppose. It's quite it's there's nothing particularly out of the ordinary or innovative in terms of how it engages with that sort of 7 to 9, 10 plus playbooks moves system. It's all fairly what you'd expect, I think, or certainly what I would expect if I had if I had a game being described as PBTA. It's sort of designed about for telling stories about revolution. In the book, it has a kind of serial numbers filed off playset for runnings of the Russian Revolution, so that era, and it's quite detailed, quite interesting. I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get around to it in a second. In specific, the game that I ran this month, I took a similar filing the numbers off approach, but instead I set it, sort of based it on the Cuban Revolution. So it was set on the fictional Caribbean island of San Judas Tadeo, which, as I say, was essentially pre-revolutionary Cuba with the numbers filed off. But yes, so I think that's, like I said, a brief overview of the game itself, or possibly not too brief. The things I liked about this, the book itself, I think, is very well written. It has a lot of detail. It answers sort of a lot of questions, and again, particularly around both the framing of the the fictional side of things, around the idea of what revolution is, how to engage with it, particularly how to engage with it safely. Has some good writing on that. It does bring sort of those safety tools and safety discussions into the body of the text, which is obviously always a good thing, particularly with something that's potentially as fraught. Is that the word I'm looking for?
I think fraught is the right word there, yeah.
So that's good. It has a very good section on running the session 0 of the game, which has some very good advice in there. I really like that. It also has kind of a advice on running the final session of the game as well, which I think is a nice touch. So it kind of get that bookending of the session. So I think there's some good general writing in the book. The playset for their fictional Russian setting, which is called Kresht, I believe, that is, again, quite detailed. It has a lot of detail on revolutionary politics, which is useful if you're not particularly au fait with...
Oh, yeah, because that is some bananas stuff. I don't think anybody has a real strong appreciation of how many factions were operating in so many different directions and ways there.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it does a good job of bringing those to the fore. And characters as well. A lot of just, very brief character write-ups, but just enough to give that detail if it's not really a sort of era of history or setting you're familiar with, which I think is very, very useful. It also gives some hints and tips on more general other revolutions to look at, though it doesn't go into those in anywhere near the detail that it does with this Kresht setting. But like I said, I think it is good that is in there. It's a useful guide to how to run it. In terms of the game itself, kind of actually similar in some ways to what you were saying about Pasión de las Pasiones just now. Some of the playbook moves are really evocative and really just do something really interesting in terms of the fiction, in terms of the story. So all the playbooks, they're essentially trope figures that you might have in the revolution. So you have kind of the student, you have the professional revolutionary, you have a demagogue. But yeah, so one of these is the worker. And they have the move called Plain Spoken, which is basically when you start up a conversation with someone who's just trying to do their damn job, if you ask them a straightforward, honest question, they will respond in kind. And I just really like that as just a very simple but very evocative move that just gets to the heart of what it wants to do. Or the other one that I really quite liked, which I didn't see him play, but it's the demagogue has a move, which is when they take harm, they get to roll and sort of inspire other players on to greater action. And
nice.
Again, it's a very fitting and very evocative move that does something a bit different that you won't get with regular basic moves. Going to the basic moves, as I said, they're quite standard stuff for PBTA games. Nothing out of the ordinary, but again, I think the choices that they give you on 7 to 9, and for instance on the sussing out information move, the questions it poses for you to ask are well done, and I think bring in some very interesting points and bring up some interesting ways forward. Like I said, not flashy, but well done, solid, and they definitely lead the story forward. The other move that I do really like, actually, that is a basic move. Sadly, I didn't get a chance to see it. I think it from a very different direction, but a similar idea to the move you discussed earlier as well. But there is the Cradle a Dying Comrade move, which basically, when one of your fellow comrades would be killed when they take 4 harm, you can roll this move. You roll with your bond with them, and depending on what you get, if you actually roll a 10 up, then they do survive to fight another day. If you roll a 7 to 9, then they will die, but that kind of inspires you to greater action, and it feeds into the other thing I want to talk about that I really enjoyed in this game, and that was Pathways to Revolution. These are a really nice idea, I think. As playing as the comrades, as it refers to the player characters in the game, you are all these kind of iconic figures that are part of the revolution. And obviously, as characters in a PBTA game, you can go out there and achieve great things and all of this. But you are obviously still just part of this overall movement that is in revolution against the state. Well, as I said, this Pathways to Revolution system, it's called, where you essentially have 5 different poles of the revolution. So these are things like zealotry, mayhem, force, fellowship, and organisation. And each one of those has a rating from 1 to 5. In those, you start with them all at 0, or possibly with one of them at 1. There's a slight bit of uncertainty in the way that one bit of the rules is worded, but that's a very minor thing.
Okay.
As you move up through these ratings, it essentially unlocks new powers, as it were, almost like a kind of a skill tree in an MMO or something like that. Most of these are kind of fictional positioning. So with the zealotry one, which was the one that my group in particular sort of focused on, they were sort of going for that rebel rousing approach. The first point in that gets you that you have a lot of supporters. If any scene you're in where it's not completely out of the question, you'll probably find somebody who supports the revolution. Sort of, pick a random person on the street, and there's a good chance they'll support the revolution. It moves up, and then you get sort of moves where you then have an influential media outlet. The next one that might be that you have there are protests and riots break out regularly and draw a lot of attention to your cause. The final one in each of them is essentially a way in which gives you an opportunity to seize power. So the zealotry one might be there is now a mass popular uprising, and if you manage that sort of base, the idea is that sets up the final session.
Okay.
And the final session, you play out the sort of crux of that revolution, with the idea that you will probably succeed. It's still possible to fail at that point, at which point you'd carry on, but you kind of at that point have momentum on your side to actually move forward with this revolution and win, essentially, which is something I like about it because it gives it an optimistic feel. The revolution should always be winnable, not necessarily easy and not necessarily at a cost you're willing to bear, but it should always be winnable, and I think that's a very important thing to how the game plays out.
It's interesting because the base version of Cryptomancer, Chad Walker's done a lot of games that have revolutionary thing, but base level of Cryptomancer is you're going to lose. Yeah. You're part of the revolution, but you're going to lose, and you're all going to die eventually, which is a striking thing that he made some changes on later on, but I agree with what you say about optimism necessary for play.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say it is also obviously very possible to play a game that isn't as optimistic, but I think for the tone that this game is going for, it needs that level of optimism, I think, that sort of system gives. The most interesting thing about the way these pathways to revolution work, as I say, that you have this like scoring mechanic on it essentially, but is that there is each one of them has an end of session move that is triggered by actions that took place during the session. So, for instance, again going back to the zealotry one, it says if you did something that was particularly flashy or eye-catching and drew people's attention to the revolution, you roll with one of the stats, and if you get a 10 up on the roll, that increases that track. If you get a 7 to 9, the track doesn't go up, everyone gets XP essentially. There's also an optional rule, which is one that I played with for shorter games, where you can take a +1 on the track, but you'll run into trouble next session. If you fail, you run into trouble next session related to that thing. There's a different trigger for each of them, and you could potentially roll all 5 of them if you had a particularly wild session. I'll say it's not an entirely new mechanic, I don't think. Or the idea of it isn't the idea of these end of session moves, but the way it works and the way it represents a wider organisation, I think is a really nice idea. Particularly one of these things, and I will also kind of touch on this in my next bit as well, some reservations I have about it, but some of the things is that some of these paths specifically have, as you go up them, fictional things that start to show a darker edge to the revolution. So, for instance, as you move up higher and higher up the force track, which is triggered by you beating your opponents with physical force, you start moving up the force track. The higher ones are things that are effective in winning you the revolution, but you start having things like you have trained street fighters who all wear a uniform, and whenever they're wearing that uniform or armband, people fear them, and it kind of builds on that authoritarian idea. There's also the mayhem track, which is triggered when you use essentially terroristic violence, essentially when you use indiscriminate violence. And the more you move up that, again, it pushes you very much towards your organisation becoming increasingly more extreme in its use of violence, which is again a really nice idea for playing out from the perspective of playing out this revolution as a living and breathing thing, separate to the characters themselves, which is I like about it. there are some issues though that I have, which I think I'll come on to in a moment. But
it sounds got some positive things, but you're hinting at some questions that you have there. So what are you less sure about with Comrades?
Certainly. So I'll carry on from where I was actually. It makes this quite clear, like I said at the beginning of the book, this is expressly about violent revolution. But I find the way the moves that you have available to you make achieving things in a non-violent fashion quite tricky.
Oh.
Not impossible, and it depends.
Right.
It depends as well what playbooks you're playing in. Some playbooks are better than others at resolving things without resorting to violence. But for instance, there's a move. The only real move that for dealing with a big group of people is called Start Something, and it's essentially for kicking off protests and demonstrations, with the idea that these sort of, on a mixed success, you start getting things like they run out of control, they're not peaceful, things like this. Other than that, you don't really have a way of changing people's minds. And I absolutely understand the perspective that the author is coming from on that. But in play, it can sometimes feel a bit coercive towards the players almost.
Oh, okay.
And as I said, again, particularly the mayhem track is something I find an issue that I don't know a good way, because quite frankly, I was almost tempted on kind of lines unveiling that out of the game entirely, because...
Oh, really?
Just because that... I mean, not even... It's because it is essentially... It's a mechanic that does... That it introduces a mechanic that incentivizes, I suppose is the way of putting it, using violence against civilians. And I am not sure how comfortable I am playing with that at the table. I think it's an important thing given the context of the game, and because obviously the idea is that it's not just painting it as a purely black and white situation. It isn't Fellowship or The Watch even.
Right.
It does have that bit more of an edge of reality to it, I suppose. But I just don't know how happy I would be with a player using terroristic violence in a game I was running.
Yeah.
And this outright mechanizes it as a sort of core feature of the game, and it's we didn't go there in the game I ran, so it wasn't that much of an issue. But that was something, I think, just something to be very aware of, that ultimately this is a game about that sort of idea of violent revolution.
Okay.
That has a very, this is my sort of point on the way it uses violence. It's the purpose of the game, but I find there is this tendency towards the sort of glorification and fetishization of these sort of, revolutionary figures and the imagery of violent revolution, which I think sometimes detracts from the important work that people do achieve without resorting to violence. We were sort of having this discussion. It's like you could not use this to run a game about the civil rights movement in the US. You couldn't use it really to run a game about playing suffragettes. So certainly not if you wanted it to kind of work to emulate how that movement worked historically. You could obviously run a game in which that happened, but things did get a bit more extreme. But I think, and I know that's not the point of this game, so it seems in some way a bit unfair to criticize it for that reason. But it is something that there is this sort of an element of machismo, I think, to this sort of portrayal of revolution.
And I think that's a fair thing to point out for people who might be looking at it. That's something to be aware of going in. So I think that's a fair comment.
Yeah, I don't think it detracts from it as a game, put it that way, but it is something I think in terms of the content of it that people should be aware of.
So that's a pretty big scale idea, but anything else that's maybe a little more granular feeling about it?
Yeah, certainly. So as I said, this is a game that harkens back to the days of sort of Apocalypse World, the first ed in particular.
So vanilla Apocalypse World?
Yeah, and a couple of the mechanical elements as a result of that are a bit clunky for my personal PBTA tastes. Or clunky or a little extraneous, I feel. Like I said, all of these kind of issues that I have with it iterate around the same idea, that it just it feels a bit bog standard, it feels a bit stock.
So you say bog standard? What do you mean by bog standard there?
So yeah, a lot of the moves don't really flow into each other in an interesting way, so it feels a bit more procedural, I suppose is the way I'd put it. Which again is why I think, particularly Dungeon World, it gets that kind of feeling to it. It definitely feels like one of those games where the player, you as the GM, put an object in front of them. the players say how they will solve that object. You move that object out of the way. You put another object in front of them. It doesn't.
Interesting.
Yeah, it doesn't really flow like. Again, it's my personal taste, but like something like Monster Hearts or Masks, where all the moves kind of snowball into each other. This just feels a bit more procedural. So yeah, I think my overall takeaway on this, it's a good, solid, well-built game. It does what it does well. It doesn't really have a genre. That's the interesting thing for a PBTA game. It has a setting or an idea, but not really a genre. I think we actually found out in the final session, which ended up just running for 2 players, what we actually ended up with was a really tight thriller feeling game. So I think that is actually where its strength lies. I suppose it comes back to that, you are moving from one challenge to the next at quite fast pace, and I think that it did nicely. It didn't particularly feel like it was emulating revolutionary fiction, shall we say. It felt much more like, just a game in which you were doing things that was also a revolution. But like I said, I enjoyed playing it, so yeah, I think it's well worth checking out.
Awesome. I really appreciate you talking with us about that, since we hadn't had it talked about here on this podcast.
No worries, thank you.
I think we're going to move to our second segment.
Yeah, certainly.
Hello, listeners. Jason here. We put a lot of care into the Gauntlet family of podcasts because we want you to be entertained and we want you to engage with these games that we love. And listening to us talk about role-playing games is great. Reading blog posts about role-playing games is great. Interacting on forums about role-playing games, such as the Gauntlet forums, that is also great. But in my opinion, nothing compares to actually playing tabletop role-playing games. And with that in mind, I want to invite you to check out our $8 Hangouts Friend Patreon tier. The Hangouts Friend tier gets you early RSVP access to new games posted on Gauntlet Hangouts, our amazing online gaming calendar, where we organize and run nearly 200 sessions per month. It is the absolute best way to get involved with the Gauntlet community, experience our awesome play culture, and importantly, play some role-playing games. We have done everything we can to make Gauntlet Hangouts as flexible and accessible as possible, and we have been successful. Over the last 2 years, we have organized 2,498 game sessions. The $8 tier also gets you access to new issues of our fantastic magazine Codex, where we publish all kinds of original games and supplements, as well as access to our Slack group, which is the heart of our community. It is a truly fantastic deal, and even if you only played in 1 or 2 games a month, it would be the best value in all of role-playing games. And not only do you get all the benefits I've mentioned here, but you also help support great podcasts like this one. So please head over to patreon.com/gauntlet and check it out. Thanks.
Listeners, for our second segment, we ask our guest to talk about something they're working on, a game they're excited about, or an RPG issues that they're interested in that they'd like to present. And so, what have you been thinking about, David?
I've been thinking about a lot of things, and I will try and be relatively concise on this. But no, mine is, I suppose, a combination of a couple of those factors. There's a couple of games that I've been working on and running that have given me some thoughts in a certain area. So I wrote an incursion for Trophy, which has been talked about a lot on here. I will talk about it a little bit because I have some interesting thoughts. I have some thoughts that are interesting to me. We'll see if they're interesting to other people. Yeah, I wrote an incursion for that for the last issue of Gauntlet, Glamour 2, so it was themed around glamour, in this case particularly around sort of fairy tales. But yeah, the thing I'm sort of interested in talking about this evening is the looking at how we can kind of go beyond the sort of the literal when we're playing role-playing games. And so what I mean by that, I guess, is I think there's a lot of role-playing games particularly a lot of trad role-playing games are very focused on the concrete, and especially when you have your sort of big splat books and all this about like the reality of the setting you're playing in, that sort of thing, which I think can be interesting and is I do enjoy, and I do enjoy reading a big setting book for a game from time to time. But what I actually find more interesting in play, and this is also probably down to my own sort of literary tastes and the like as well, but I like games that play a bit more with symbolism, with subtext, with the interior of characters as well, which is why I said that move in Pasión de las Pasiones really appealed to me. That idea of the sort of having a soliloquy, that very much appeals to my personal gaming tastes. And so yeah, I just wanted to have sort of a little chat on that really. My starting point for this being Trophy was specifically because I think if you've read Trophy at all, and probably from what you've heard people talking about on the podcast, well, it is obviously this game about exploring this dark forest or other similar setting and searching for treasure and meeting monsters and all this sort of thing. That's not what the game's really about. The game is about the characters themselves and what they bring into the forest and how that interacts with the forest and how the forest changes them. And you get this really interesting growth of characters and exploring characters in the moment rather than, having a big info dump at the beginning where you kind of recite your character's deeds. You get this sort of situation where their backstory is sort of filled in play, where the sort of the theme of the incursion sort of drives that backstory a bit as well. I always find, certainly from my experiences of sort of running and playing it, which is a few times now. So the incursions are obviously all written around a thematic idea, and because they're quite structured, they can kind of escalate to that idea the GM is given in the incursions, and when you're writing the incursions, the conditions and these events that happen during the game. And because you can kind of tie everything in quite nicely in a thematic way and come up with motifs. Some of those motifs will be sort of baked into that incursion, and some of them you can kind of evolve as a group as you sort of build that sort of sense of a shared imagery and narrative.
Let me ask you this with that, because I think what you're pointing out is really interesting, and you're certainly talking about it from the GM establishing motifs and the incursion itself written by the designer to set that up. How much of that do you think you need to explicitly talk to the players about at the start? Do you give them an explicit sense that this is what the themes are about, or how do you find or set that up to get at those things?
That's a good question, actually. I suppose I'm thinking from my perspective of GMing. I've only ran my own incursions in a couple of playtest scenarios. The overt theme, the theme of fairy tales, I was quite open with, and I said this is going to be based on fairy tale tropes, not fairy tale ideas. It probably does rely on a certain amount of players allowing themselves to be led through it, while also one of the things I like that encourages in Trophy, I mean, much like PBTA games, etc., but is always asking questions to the players when things happen. That's how does this make you, how does this make your character feel? What does this remind your character of? And I think in that way, particularly when it's talking about, okay, you see this, this particular, you walk into this beautiful fairy glade, sunlight coming down through the leaves and all this. What does it remind you of that you've seen in, the most beautiful scenery you've seen before you came into the forest, and things like that? You kind of can get those you can build up those thematic links from the point of view of the GM, and I think from the point of view of a player, it's a case of letting that sort of imaginary aspect of it, I suppose, engage you and latching onto it. And I think it does, in some ways, ask quite a bit of the players. I think it is definitely a game where you do have to sort of engage with that. It encourages you to build on those details and invent the story for yourself as you go through it, and to kind of explore from your perspective.
So maybe we're not being explicit about this incursion is about this theme, but that we give the GM, or the GM uses leading questions that point towards that. Like, that's how we're framing it, is we're using those questions and we're shaping them in a very particular way, like Jason has talked about before, that the question loads in information that points towards the thematic or the motif, and then the player gets to build on that lead.
Exactly. And as I say, I think a lot of it as well does just come about organically and collaboratively, just around the table. It's it doesn't always need to be led by the GM. If like the player brings up a particularly cool detail, and people tend to latch onto that. That's the thing I really like about that's one of the things I really like about looking at games in a slightly more meta-narrative, subtextual way. Plays is that sort of really engages with that sort of shared consciousness stuff, which I think is cool.
We had a lot of that in the 12 sessions we did of the Tales Things from the Flood, at least in the last half, and even in the first half, that idea of fatherhood and what it meant to have a father, and that relationship with fathers ended up becoming a repeated motif that the players built on throughout.
Exactly, and I think it's that sort of reincorporation, and the old things I say about like human brains recognizing patterns and all this sort of thing. And it's a way I think that we're naturally set up to engage with stories, because this is how a lot of media that we consume, you do take these themes on without them necessarily being explicit. And I think it's a way of kind of engaging that sort of mindset whilst role-playing is something that really appeals to me.
What other games do you see that are doing these kinds of things well, or have those baked in, or taking new approaches?
I'm sad we don't have Jason here this evening to get into this, because another game that I think does this really well is obviously The Between. If you've heard any of the Jason discussing it on the podcast before, his in-development game, and there's a couple of brilliant techniques he uses in there that really engage that part of your brain, or at least that part of my brain. The overscene, which he's talked about, I'll try not to go into too much detail on these.
Yeah, no, just give us a sense of what that might be.
Exactly.
For the
so
audience.
with the overscene, you have these scenes where you narrate something that's going on in the city and in the evening that game takes place. And there are prompts for it, essentially. You're given prompts that you establish. So you don't have to just completely come up with something whole cloth. You're given a scenario in which you have to invent some details, a little short vignette. And then you are specifically incentivized. You've basically, in later scenes, you do something that kind of links back to that vignette, or all those vignettes that everyone presents. You get a point of XP. So, that's a nice little positive feedback there.
Uh-huh.
But the important thing I think about it is it just you start to build up this shared visual, or not just visual, but sensory vocabulary amongst the players. You start creating associations between certain things, and again, because explicitly these are not related to the plot, you don't have to worry about them being plot relevant. It's just adds detail, but that detail, I think, is just what reinforces ideas in people's minds, even if they're not thinking about it. And you start to get some nice sort of convergence of things that people are talking about. And also another one that he uses is this new, I think it's the dusk scene, I may be getting that name wrong, where you have a frame, a very short scene with everyone, all the player characters together in one place in the evening as they're preparing to go out hunting monsters. And everyone has these bonds between them, these relationships between them. And you get to frame how that relationship comes up, but through the perspective, just through it has to be something non-verbal. You can't have a conversation about it. You just have to see your character doing something that makes that, or observing something that highlights that particular relationship. And again, that's a really nice way of looking at the internal life of the character that I think is really interesting.
It's interesting because one of the things we're seeing here is certainly you're talking about players laying out material for other players, and I always picture as well that the GM is another kind of audience for what the player is doing, and almost like an acting coach in some ways. Like, we need to see this reaction from you. We need to know how you react from this to tell the broader story here. So we're kind of doing that director without plot. We're directing for how you're selling things in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a really interesting way. And I mean, again, I think, having played a fair bit of Hearts of Wheeling as well, I think there's some nice bits that you see in there. The things I think particularly work nicely. I mean, again, something that's been discussed before, but the idea of obviously combat just being a metaphor for the relationships that drive the reason for that conflict happening in the first place is great. One of the things I really like in the system is the way that you get to choose as a character your fighting style and what weapon you use, as well as your sort of standard look. And those, again, especially when you look at kind of wuxia films and all of this, those things tell you so much about a character, but without you ever having to be explicit about it. And because obviously there's no mechanical weight to what style you use or what weapon you use. It's all about the how it's described and what you do. I think that's just such a sort of fertile grounds for really telling a lot about a character in just a very subtle way. So that's a really cool thing.
It strikes me that, as we're talking about this, that one of the games that I think gets sometimes overlooked because it does lean into these issues and things a lot is The Veil. I think The Veil very explicitly talks about, okay, here's the themes you're going to be looking at in play. Players have beliefs, our characters have beliefs. I mean, they're mechanized in terms of XP, but they're also very much about exploring those kinds of meta issues, and players tend to tie those together once they start seeing those beliefs out on the table. Fraser's brilliant thing about using color to express theme, choosing a few colors, connecting them to particular thematic elements and using those, I think some people went to the Veil and said, oh, it's our PBTA Cyberpunk game. And I'm like, well, it's a lot more than that. And I think it's doing a lot of what you're talking about with some really creative tools there.
That's really interesting. I must admit, it's still sort of on my list at the moment. I've I mean, ironically, because cyberpunk isn't really my genre, it's not one I have a huge amount of interest in. So it's always slipped below others in terms of getting around to like reading through it. But no, that I think that's definitely going to have to move up the list now. I think because that does sound really interesting.
Yeah, I think The Veil is certainly one of my top 3 PBTA games.
Brilliant.
If not my favorite, it's definitely in those top 3.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Anything else you want to point to on this concept?
I'm going to be running Kieran Gillen's Die game, which is
that's so cool.
Yeah, it's so it's based on his comic of the same name, which is about some players who play a role-playing game. It is about playing role-playing games. I mean, Kieran is a gamer himself, as much as I hate to use that term, that word, but and you can really tell in the way he writes. But the thing I find really interesting about that is the idea that you create characters who are the characters who will be playing the role-playing game, and then those characters create the characters that they will be playing in the role-playing game that they are playing. The characters that you create to be your personas is the term he uses for it. You're essentially your meta player characters. That whole element of the game is entirely non-mechanical. It's purely about establishing the relationships between all of your characters and how they think about each other, what they've done with their life, and all this sort of thing. And then they in turn play characters and the adventures they have. If you've read either the game or the book, I use adventures in the biggest scare quotes I can find that they have will touch back onto the underlying tensions of their like friend group, and it's I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth into that.
We've run many years of this campaign where players play a character in the real world and then they're playing characters in these different portals, and over time you use those characters to comment on who they are in the real world and so on. And yeah, I love that whole meta level. It can be tough to track, but it's so good.
But yes, I think that's probably all I wanted to say on that topic, Ray.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate you letting us dig into that. It's something we haven't talked about, and I love getting a chance. This is, of course, RPG Theory Month. So I think this is wonderfully appropriate for us to dig a little bit into that, especially in the context of play. Because what you've been talking about has been in the context of things that we have played and we've looked at.
Well, no, thank you, and thank you very much for having me and listening to me. Well,
let's hold on. We're going to go to this last segment here.
Of course, we are.
Yeah,
how could I forget?
Yeah. Yes, and so listeners, we'll go to our final segment. So, listeners, this is Giving Me Life. So, Lowell, what's giving you life? Well, I'll answer my own question here. I've been watching. And I say watching, but actually more listening to the dumbest thing on YouTube that I could possibly find. There are channels where someone will go through and will explain the entire plot of big JRPGs that I'm never going to play. Games that I'm not going to get to, I'm not going to get to play, like Magna Carta 2 and Bravely Default and the last Final Fantasy 13 Lightning Returns that I started and couldn't get through, a bunch of these, and they are bananas. When you hear the entire plot of a JRPG, all told in 45 minutes, it is so all over the place, and it's just wonderful. Final Fantasy V, actually hearing it laid out, A to Z, wow. And there are a few more modern JRPGs that, like the 999 series of like puzzle games that I listened to the whole thing of it, that I don't even know how they flowcharted this, how they plotted this. I will tell you, it will get you weird dreams when you listen to these, but it is wondrous. So I recommend finding those what happened or full story videos on YouTube for these games. David, what's giving you life?
Well, I've funnily enough, I almost said the new Final Fantasy 14 expansion coming out, which I got very sucked into, but that's probably almost the opposite. But instead, I will be what my sort of highlight again, media-wise, in June was I got around to watching the first season of Pose, which is phenomenal. For those who aren't aware, I'd seen some people chatting about it and saying it was really good on Twitter and stuff, but never actually really mentioning what it was. So I was like, okay, cool, fine, whatever. I'll keep an eye out, and if I see it somewhere, I'll watch it, because I've heard good things. But in the Gauntlet Slack, someone was talking about it, and so what it is, getting to the point finally, is that it's a TV series about the New York ballroom scene in the mid to late 80s. So it's about a group of relatively young queer people living, particularly people of color, living in sort of at the poverty line in New York, putting on these ball shows, these sort of drag shows and the like. So there's a problem, a lot of queer fiction runs into, where it can be very, there's sort of sad gay tropes and stuff. And what this series, I think, manages to do really well is it manages to capture the realities of sort of the queer scene of the time, which obviously had a lot of bad things happening, had a lot of tragedy. Yeah. And it does not minimize that or negate it, but it lets the characters be happy and it lets them find some joy. The performances in it are amazing. In like a sadly unusual turn of fate, they actually have the trans actors in it. I think almost exclusively played by trans people, by trans actors. So that's, it shouldn't be a high bar, but here we are.
There we are, yeah.
And it's glorious. The performances are amazing. It really, honestly, did fill me with life, and I had a lot of good time with it. Sadly, we don't have the second season out here in the UK yet, so I'm waiting on that. I believe it is out there in the States at the minute. So if you haven't checked it out yet, do. It's very good.
Awesome. Listeners, that's our show. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter at Gauntlet RPG. Of course, we have a Patreon that supports our whole network of podcasts. At the base level, you also get access to our monthly magazine codex. We have a set of free forums that you can check out, where there's a lot of discussion about games and game theory and so on. And of course, we also have the Gauntlet Hangouts online calendar. I encourage you to check all that out. If you've enjoyed this podcast, consider rating or leaving a comment, that kind of thing. Any of that attention on any of your podcatchers of choice will help us get a little more attention, so that is appreciated. David, thank you for coming on and talking with me about a whole range of topics today.
Well, thank you for having me on, and it's been really good fun to just sit down and have a chat. So, thank you.
And listeners, that's our show.